Indeed.
Thank you.
There we go. Let me start by asking you the question, how do you know that somebody cares about you? Or how do you show somebody else that you care about them? Perhaps you will use words. I think that's a very common way that we both express care and we expect other people to express care for us. For example, if you're suffering a loss, then words from someone close to you can bring you comfort, and it can show to you that they acknowledge what is going on and that they want to be with you in it and part of it. What about when you're celebrating something? For example, today is my nephew's birthday. It's nothing to do with lockdowns. He lives in Dubai. So me and the kids and Charlotte, my wife, and even my son's cuddly toy dog recorded a little video for him singing happy birthday. It's a way that we can, just through the words that we use, demonstrate that we've got a measure of interest in another person's life. But what speaks louder than words? Actions. Actions are the ultimate way of showing that you care, aren't they? When you flip it on its head and you think about the converse, then it becomes even more apparently true. When we observe inactivity, then it's fair and right that we conclude that that person doesn't care. If you're suffering and nobody comes to you, nobody acts, nobody picks up the phone to call you, then you've got to conclude that they don't really care that much. My nephew in Dubai, if all we do is say happy birthday and don't send him a gift, don't send him a card, then it kind of gives the impression, doesn't it, that we don't actually care about him. When there's no surprise birthday party, when there's no hug or no hot meal or something tangible, some action used to express care and concern and interest, then we can rightly conclude or summarize that there's no concern there at all. Okay, let's move on from that little question and ask another question. Have you ever been in the circumstance where the thought has crossed your mind, God, why aren't you doing anything? Not why aren't you doing X or why aren't you doing Y? Not God, I don't like what's going on in my life. But why does it appear to me that there's the absolute absence of any action? Why does it just feel like in this circumstance, you're not doing anything? Have you ever been in that sort of situation? Maybe you're in it now. The pressure cooker around you is building. The temperature is rising. It's you, it's God. And it matters a lot when it feels like nothing else is going on. We ask the question then, God, don't you care? Don't you have any concern about me? I think maybe if you haven't experienced it in that personal way, if you're not going through it now, we can kind of ask a similar question, although less personally, but just as significantly, when we hear stories from our families, when we hear stories from our towns, when we turn on the news and globally we hear stories of affliction, of suffering, of distress, we can sit down, we can just as genuinely, although less personally, sit and reflect and ask, doesn't God care about any of that? If he's not doing anything, does he care at all? It's like almost like where we do a little logic puzzle in our minds. Surely, if he cared, he would act. And when we observe inactivity, we come to the conclusion, perhaps God doesn't care. And for some people, even they take it a step further. Maybe that's you this morning. I don't know all of you. I don't know who in total is even tuning in. But for some people, it goes a step further. It doesn't just cause us to wonder whether God cares, but it causes us to take the rubber out and to erase God from history altogether. If he's not active, then not only does he not care, but he doesn't even exist. There's that spectrum of responses, and you could be anywhere on there this morning, from asking the question in a deeply personal way, from the slightly detached but still important way, or having already drawn that sure and certain conclusion that God doesn't even exist. And if you do identify with any of those, then by the way, this morning you are welcome, because you are not alone. You're not the only one feeling those feelings or asking those questions. It's totally normal. It's totally relatable to have and to feel those things. And not only are you not alone here in this meeting this morning, but you're not actually alone in asking those sorts of questions throughout history, because people have wrestled genuinely with these sorts of questions. Astoundingly, I think, even people who walked and talked and ate and drank with Jesus asked these sorts of questions. And I think it's incredible. I think it's amazing that when we come to our Bibles and when we come to the Gospels in particular, we get to eavesdrop on conversations, on questions that are asked of Jesus and the answers that he gives to them. Conversations people had with him, and, well, questions that we might like to ask him. But most importantly, the answers that he gave. That's exactly what we have in Mark chapter 4, which Nathaniel more than alluded to, which I think was great, which Nigel has already read for us. It's the story, yes, of Jesus calming the storm, but it's as much a story of that miracle as it is a recounting of a Q&A that he had with his closest friends. And I think it's a Q&A that actually we could put ourselves into as well. Because you see, there is in the story a perceived inactivity in Jesus, isn't it? And it caused those who were nearest and dearest to him to come together and in unison cry out, "Don't you even care about us, Jesus?" It caused them to genuinely question whether he cared about them as much as they cared about him. They questioned, in fact, whether he cared about them at all. Questioned whether he was interested in whether they lived or not, whether they died. And so this morning, I think we can actually take a lot. We can learn a lot when we listen to their question, when we can hear them echoing a question we'd love to ask in so many different circumstances. But most importantly, when we can hear Jesus' answer. So I'm just going to read the passage one more time, because it's a quick passage, and I think it will really serve us to have this story in our minds and our hearts. On that day, when evening had come, he told them, that is Jesus, "Let's cross over to the other side of the sea." So they left the crowd and took him along, since he was in a boat, and other boats were with them. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking over the boat, so that the boat was already being swamped. He was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion, and so they woke him up, and they said to him, "Teacher, don't you care that we're going to die? Don't you care that we're about to perish?" Jesus got up. He rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Silence, be still." There's exclamation points in my translation, which I quite enjoy. The wind ceased, and there was a great calm. And then they said to him, then he said to them, I beg your pardon, "Why are you afraid? Do you still have no faith?" And they were terrified and asked one another, "Who is this then, even that the wind and the sea obey him?" Now, I seriously doubt, I hope that no one has been on a boat in that serious a storm. Perhaps maybe a few. I don't know what weird and wonderful and exciting sort of stories Nathaniel has got back from his time in Japan. But my guess is none of us have been on a boat that's in that much peril. But regardless of that, we can relate, can't we? We can relate to the fear, to the terror that grips them in that moment. They're not just uncomfortable. They're not just dissatisfied with the situation they're in. They are fearing for their very lives. And we can picture it, even if it's just kind of drawing to mind films or TV shows that we've seen, of the wind howling around, of the waves crashing and banging against the boat, of the boat itself swaying and rocking, and even the wood groaning under the pressure that it's feeling. We can relate to that. But stop and think about it. There's nothing to worry about, is there? Because they've got someone extremely special with them in the boat. They've got, in this terrifying situation, someone they've already witnessed deal definitively with disease and sicknesses. They've got someone in the boat, someone that they've already witnessed dismiss disobedient demonic beings. They've got someone with them who they've already witnessed stare down spiritual death and in its place offer forgiveness and life. If you go back and you read the first couple of chapters of Mark's gospel, they've already been with Jesus when he's done all these wonderful, miraculous things. More than that, he's the one who's invited them to follow him. And not just to follow him on some crazy mad adventures for a time. He's invited them to follow him into full and abundant life. So the storm is scary. Of course it's scary. Of course it's terrifying, but they are traveling with Jesus. Now, just imagine that. They're traveling with Jesus, and surely that makes all the difference. Well, except at the moment, it doesn't seem to be making any difference at all. The wind is getting stronger. Each crushing wave is getting louder and louder. And this Jesus, who they have observed doing so much in front of their very eyes, he's literally nowhere to be seen. When push comes to shove, when the chips are finally down, when the rubber hits the road, when words are worthless and actions are worth their weight in gold, when everything is out of control, Jesus is sleeping. He's asleep. You could not get a better picture of inactivity, could you? You could not get a better picture of someone who simply isn't concerned about the circumstances, or apparently concerned about his comrades in those circumstances. Even if we kind of set aside some time now this morning to and create our own story, write our own parable, if you like, of inactivity and a lack of concern, we wouldn't come close to providing a better picture than this. A picture of how we all feel when darkness surrounds us, when it presses in on us from every side, and it seems like God is doing nothing at all. I'm laboring this point because I want us to see and to recognize we can relate to this. We can put ourselves in those disciples' seats on that boat. We totally get the question, and we totally expect the question now from their lips. Don't you care that we're about to drown? Don't you care that we're about to die? We've never been in the boat, but we can relate to it. Their question is our question, uttered in 1,000 different circumstances. And Jesus's answer comes in two parts. You'll have already noticed this. He speaks first to the storm, and then secondly, he speaks to the disciples. Well, what does he say to the storm? It would be awesome if there was some formula of words that Jesus used, some magic phrase that he uttered that meant that the waves died down and the wind ceased. But all he says in essence is this: hush up, be still. And with those simple words, as I said, is an exclamation mark in my translation, which to me suggests he said it more forcefully than that. But even with those simple words, the waves and the wind are silenced and calmed. And that's astounding, isn't it? It's amazing that all that was utterly terrifying to Jesus's followers is trivial to Jesus. Trivial. How Jesus treats that storm shows us, if nothing else this morning, that his inactivity may mean many things, but it doesn't show that he has a lack of ability, that he can't do anything about the situation that they're in. The fact that he hadn't intervened up until that point wasn't because he was unable to do something about the raging seas. And actually, throughout the Bible, again, Nathaniel touched on this, didn't he? It's the raging seas that have been used as a measuring stick for power and authority and control. And in biblical imagery is when humanity comes face to face with the raging seas, with the oceans. They're used as a symbol of the untamable, even as a symbol of the unknowable, of something that's beyond humankind. But when God comes face to face with them, they are, just as they are here with Jesus, utterly trivial. One of my favorite examples of that comes in Psalm 33. Psalm 33 is a meditation on the majesty, on the grandeur, on the authority of God. And in it, we find this thought: by the word of the Lord, the heavens were made, their starry host by the breath of his mouth. He gathers the waters of the sea into jars, and he puts the deep into storehouses. To God, all of this, which is terrifying to us, is just like filling a bottle from a tap. The vast oceans in their entirety, they're nothing to him, nor to Jesus. That which causes his followers to presume that there's an impending death to him is just nought. Nothing that a word can't dismiss anyway. But ability and power and authority, they're just part of the puzzle. Because the question wasn't, can you do something about this, teacher? They knew that he could. Without a shadow of a doubt, all the time that they'd spent with him leading up until this moment had shown them the sort of divine power and authority that Jesus could wield with a word or with a touch or with a glance. And so, if anything, that just makes it even more puzzling, even more troubling, all the more concerning, because of course he can do something about it. The problem was he wasn't. The question was never, can you? The question was, will you? Or more accurately, I suppose, why aren't you doing something about it? They cry out, don't you care? And so now we come to Jesus' answer to them. Don't you care that we are going to die? And Jesus says, why are you afraid? Do you still have no faith? By the time that he speaks those words, he has now already acted. He's dealt with the very thing that has caused them to question his concern and the thing that has filled them with dread. But I'm not sure that his response to the disciples is particularly satisfying to us at first glance. I said it's great that we can come and we can eavesdrop in on the conversations. We can hear their questions and hear Jesus's answer, almost as if Jesus is answering us. But my guess is you're not finding that as an answer in and of itself very satisfying. Why are you afraid? Where is your faith? Apparently, Jesus' answer to the question about his inactivity filling them with dread, his answer isn't, pith and simple and sorts everything out straight away. His answer is, why don't you have faith in this situation? The missing ingredient, according to Jesus, wasn't his activity or otherwise, but it was his disciples' faith in him. Is that satisfying? Well, I think probably not, because we've got a very fuzzy relationship or a fuzzy idea of what faith really is. We need to grapple with what faith really is if we're to understand and be satisfied and be assisted and helped this morning by Jesus' answer. I think all too often we settle for an idea, a concept of faith, which is a little more than blind optimism, crossing our fingers and wishing that things would turn out okay-ish. For most of us, that is our idea of faith. Just hoping that the outcomes will somehow be better than it might appear in the first instance. And so if that is the case, if that is what faith is to us, how we understand it, we have to say that Jesus is saying to them, as the clouds grew thicker and darker and angrier overhead, what they really needed was to just close their eyes and wish bigger wishes. But that I mean, that just doesn't make sense, does it? That idea of faith, of blind optimism, really doesn't do justice to the situation. It certainly doesn't do justice to the word. Wonderfully, though, we're not left with that terrible definition of faith. Later in the New Testament, one of Jesus's followers, in a moment of sublime clarity, defines what faith really is. In the letter we call Hebrews, it comes chapter 11, verse 1. This is how they put it. Now, faith is confidence or assurance in what we hope for, and confidence about what we do not see. Faith is confidence in the unseen. And that is a wonderfully clear statement about what faith is. But seriously, though, I still think it's a difficult one for us to wrap our heads around, because even that, on the surface of it, doesn't seem like it's too far away from the flimsy type of faith that we cling to, or definition, when we think of it as blind optimism. Blind optimism and confidence in the unseen. It doesn't seem to be too much of a difference there. But the disciple who penned the true definition in Hebrews chapter 11 goes on to describe what that looked like in the life of many ancient saints. You can look at it yourself, names you will be familiar with, the sorts of names that Nathaniel will do a story on, he either has or he will. And he mentions people like Noah and Abraham and Sarah and Samuel and David. And one of the things you'll notice about all these people is that they're not people who blindly hope for the best. That's not what faith was for them. That wasn't faith exercised in their lives. These were all people who had already heard. These were people who had already seen and already experienced something of God. These were people who had experienced in their life a God who made promises and kept promises. They'd seen and experienced it for themselves, and that allowed them to keep their hope in other promises and the fulfillment of those other promises, even before they'd come to pass. That's what the author sees as confidence in the unseen, assurance in what has yet to pass. It isn't foundless, because I think that's probably a better way of describing our bad idea. Blind faith, blind optimism, is foundless. But the faith that is spoken of, that is demonstrated, that is exhorted in the Bible, isn't foundless, it's founded. It's founded and it's responding to what God has already revealed. There's something about experiencing God in one moment and therefore trusting him in the next. That is what we call faith. And so when Jesus, we'll go back to there, Mark chapter 4, answered his disciples with those challenging words, "Where is your faith?" we need to remember that they had already seen and experienced so much. He'd already promised to love them and to care for them and to lead them into life. So faith in their present darkness, in the present storm that they literally faced, would have been hanging on, continuing to hang on to the light that they'd already received. "Don't you care?" they asked. And Jesus could have answered, "I've already told you and I've already shown you how much I do care." Where's your faith? Have you forgotten everything that has happened up until this point? That's how Jesus responded to the storm. That's how Jesus responded to the disciples. So let's just quickly finish thinking about, well, what does that mean in terms of his response to us when we ask questions like this one? Don't you care, God? Why aren't you doing anything? We weren't on the boat. Presumably our fears are being stoked by something different altogether. The question is coming from a different scenario. We've never been face to face with Jesus. We've never witnessed him doing these miracles. We haven't heard from his very lips the sort of promises that he made to his disciples. So what on earth can he be saying to us? What past experience, what faithfulness already can we draw on in faith to trust in him in dark and desperate situations? Well, I think our gut response to my very first question, how do you show someone you care is right? I think that we genuinely know that somebody cares about us when we see them act. The person can say whatever they want to say, but unless it's followed up with action, ultimately it means nothing. You prove the validity of any statement you make about caring with the deeds that you do. Words are a starting point, but action is what really seals the deal. And if you read through the rest of Mark's gospel, then you'll read your way through the record of Jesus' life, of his death, of his resurrection, and you'll discover that Jesus didn't just make promises to the people who were following him, but to anyone who would follow him. Promises like this: whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it. Whoever gives up everything to follow me will make it back 100-fold. Promises like this: I have not come to be served, but to serve and to give my life as a ransom for many. These weren't just words spoken to a niche gang in Israel wandering around with their rabbi, but these were words that were extended as an offer to each and every one of us. And they were backed up by action. This is what we so often miss, I think, in our present circumstances, is that Jesus acted once and definitively for all those who would follow him. He backed up everything that he ever said, everything that he ever promised at the cross. He backed it up by dying and crushing the darkest storms which we face of sin and Satan and death, and rising to new and everlasting life again. Jesus has acted, dying in our place and rising as our pioneer. So we sit now in a place and in a time where we can look back over all of that and know without a shadow of a doubt that he does care. We know without a shadow of a doubt that he does love us because he has acted. So faith for us then isn't foundless. It isn't blind optimism. It isn't closing our eyes, crossing our fingers and wishing that things would turn out for the best. It's being certain in the unseen because of the certainty of what has already been. Faith for us is trusting in that in-between time. The truth is, what terrifies you today is trivial to Jesus. We know that he is the most powerful person ever to live. He is God, power beyond comprehension. But it doesn't mean that what terrifies you is unimportant to Jesus. And what's immediate to us isn't being ignored by him either. Perhaps we need to recognize that there is waiting involved. Perhaps we need to acknowledge that there is unnoticed action going on in the background. But we cannot draw the conclusion that there is a lack of concern or a lack of love, because Jesus has already acted. And that is good news for all of us, because whatever circumstances we are in today, we can confidently come to Jesus with that question, don't you care? And know that the answer is, you know that I care. You've seen how much I care. Now trust me that I continue to care through all of this. They ask the question, so might we. And Jesus answers with more than words. He answers with his very life and his death and his rising to life again in our place.